Welcome to the Child Welfare Information Technology Systems Managers and Staff webinar series brought to you on behalf of the Health and Human Services Administration for Children and Families, Children's Bureau, and presented by ICF. Today's discussion is entitled Managing a Hybrid Agile Project, a Conversation with Delaware-Focused Leadership. I am Elizabeth Martinko, your host and moderator for today's webinar. Attendees are encouraged to participate in our webinar with questions and comments. All of our participant lines are muted now, but we will open them at the end of the presentation for questions and conversation. You also can submit questions at any time using the GoToWebinar chat feature, and those will be addressed during the discussion. You should see the GoToWebinar dialog box generally to the right of your screen. If you don't see an open dialog box, look for a small white arrow inside an orange box. Click that, and it opens the dialog screen. Scroll down until you find question, and you can submit questions that way. We also understand that some listeners have very specific questions about how CWIS will operate and about certain topics in the context of CWIS. In these cases, we encourage people to either send their questions to ccwis.questions@acf.hhs.gov or just to chat informally with their federal analyst.
If you have any additional questions, please contact Elizabeth Martinko after the webinar by emailing elizabeth.mertinko@icfi.com.
Delaware's Focus project uses a hybrid Agile approach that incorporates Agile practices and a fixed scope. The state and project leadership emphasize disciplined monitoring of plans and progress. Our speakers today will discuss their successes and challenges, talk about their Agile approaches for software development, describe their best practices for project management and monitoring impediments and risks, and answer questions from participants. So let's meet today's speakers. Today we're fortunate to have Laura Miles, State Functional Lead and Executive Product Owner, Mike Myron, Information Resource Manager, and Peter DeYoe, the Project Director. So I'd like to thank you all for joining us, and I'm going to start us off with our first question. So Delaware seems to be operating a modified Agile project for FACS 2, Agile development and testing, and then a single state rollout for the system as a whole. What guided this decision? Timing, budget, practicality, or was it an executive decision?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. This is Laura Miles responding to this question. Before I respond to the question, I want to set the stage for a moment about our department. We have a 1,200-person department, including the service divisions covering child abuse and neglect, foster care and adoption, Office of Child Care Licensing, criminal history in one service division, the Prevention and Behavioral Health Services division that covers everything from prevention, early intervention, to deep-end services in crisis and residential treatment services. We also have, under our department's umbrella, the Division of Youth Rehabilitative Services, which houses our juvenile justice arm. And then last but not least, the service division for which I reside is Division of Management Support Services. It does include in our new information system features such as contracts and grants, fiscal, interstate compact administration, and some other features that will be highlighted in the Focus solution. Now back to the question. Since we are developing a system that integrates the four service divisions that I just highlighted, it was not feasible to split the effort out into distinct production releases over the course of the project. Presently, our current information system has those four divisions in very stovepipe casework lines. This new solution, FACS 2, we renamed it as Focus, brings those four service divisions together in our SACWIS system, and we needed to bring that together under a big bang. In addition, timing and budget was also a critical factor. We needed to ensure we delivered the new product timely and on budget.
Okay. How was your approach to work plan different for this project than it was for a traditional waterfall project? As you set up your work plan, did you start to think about your monitoring and reporting needs to manage the project?
Yes, hi, good afternoon. This is Peter DeYoe. think it's important. I'm not sure how many folks on the line who have actually engaged in an Agile project in the past. But if you've been involved in the development of systems, you know that some of the key distinctions between Waterfall and Agile our Waterfall really focuses on large blocks, if you will, phases that include things like the requirements phase and the design phase, build, test, implement, excuse me, and they're really implemented in sequentially. And so you may have a fairly long stretch of time that you're building requirements. And then you go through a whole acceptance and of those requirements before you move into design. And then the same thing with design into build, test, and implement. So in that, months can go by without really having any software built at all. Whereas in Agile, our focus is really to build incrementally. And we have basically built for this particular program a Agile methodology we use, and we use Scrum, which I'm sure some of you have heard of that. Scrum is short increments of process, where within that increment we're doing requirements, design, build, test, and sometimes implementation in an Agile framework. In our case, as Laura mentioned a minute ago, we're really doing one implementation at the end. But as part of this difference, we have to track the progress and the development of capability incrementally. And we do that essentially by using a point system. We call them story points. And we track the progress of the project through story points. And then we also have things like product backlogs. And we're managing a product backlog through its cycle. The product backlog essentially incorporates everything that's supposed to be built in the project. And then we break those out into smaller increments and sprints. And then we track those sprints based on points within the project. And then we can also, because we are collecting history on how successful we are in achieving these points, we can begin forecasting what we call our velocity. How many points are we going to accomplish in any given sprint? And a sprint is a fixed time box, which we never change. And so we can begin estimating how well we're going to meet and how well we're meeting the progress of the project. And then we have programs where we need frequent inspection. So where we've had to build very strong processes and what we call a cadence by which we're monitoring the progress of software development in these small increments, and then acceptance criterion that our product owners all operate on to accept working software into a sprint. So the cadence of a project where we have a 4-week sprint is very aggressive, and it's always a very challenging process to get all the things we need to do in a sprint completed. But by establishing a cadence to manage those things and monitor the behavior, our work plan then really effectuates that process. And with having a consistent cadence and having consistent measurement, we can then really track our progress on the project. In our particular case, we actually began with an overall project management and governance framework, which kind of codified the key aspects of Agile, and then drove the development of our work plan from an Agile Scrum perspective. And so we are continuously monitoring and reporting all of our progress against our sprint expectations, and we measure the project essentially by key performance indicators throughout the engagement. Some of those key performance indicators include management support on the project, project team morale, how motivated are the team members, product quality. We're constantly testing working software, and we're constantly measuring how well it meets expectations. Risk management, everything essentially. I actually like to think of software development as a very large risk management game because there are risks at all stages of the project, and being able to recognize those through measurements, metrics, monitoring, and then raising them to the awareness of all stakeholders in the project, we can determine what areas that we need to focus all of our energy on to ensure that risks are mitigated. Our schedule management process and monitoring that as a key performance indicator, how well are we meeting schedule, and are we following the cadence that we've established for ourselves effectively? And then stakeholder involvement. How engaged are all the people who are going to be interacting with this system, from our cabinet secretary down to our frontline workers who are operating as subject matter experts on this project. And then, of course, measuring and managing time from a key performance indicator. So it really starts with an overall governance framework that's been adapted to Agile, and then beginning to build your work plans and organizing your work plans against the individual sprints, against a well-established cadence. And then the other thing is you've got to be willing to adapt that cadence to things that you begin to engage or experience on the project. And we've had to do that a number of times in this project, where we've had to relook at our cadence and determine, in fact, its effectiveness. And we have made progress changes, process improvements to increase our performance and effectiveness during that progress. So there are a lot of differences in how we organize our work plan, but I think one of the most important things is the fundamental frameworks of any project management really rely on some of those key performance indicators that I mentioned before.
Great, thank you. So on to our third question. It's a multi-part question. How did you and your vendor reach agreement on the content and timing of routine management data and status reporting? How often are you getting these status reports? And after the project started, did you make any adjustments in the kind of data or type of reports you wanted for more informed project management?
Yes, this is PTO again. In this particular engagement, we had been working with the vendor, and we were actually in the process of doing a restructuring of a previous project. And during that restructuring is really where we made some decisions about methodology, moving from a waterfall approach to an agile approach. And at that time, we really established this project management office and governance authority that really kind of measures and monitors. From that, there are a number of, call it project management aspects that we needed to attend to in our project. One of the first things we did in terms of trying to provide this routine management data and status reporting is we established a program which our vendor brought in called Tracker. And just in case anybody is not aware of what we're doing here, we are, in conjunction with using an Agile methodology, we have moved to a cloud-based technology for for our system, for our focus system. And by the way, it's been known as FACS2 for many years. We have kind of rebranded it as Focus internally. And with the Focus project, we established a program called Tracker, which actually sits in Salesforce, and the vendor brought it to bear. And with Tracker, it allows us to maintain detailed metrics on all aspects of our project, quality measures, performance measures, burn downs against our story points. Everything is really at our fingertips. We measure every issue and track that through Tracker. We measure every risk. It's all logged and recorded, and statuses are updated against those risks using this system. And what it does is it really provides us with not just the ability to generate, weekly status reports, for instance, but we literally have live real-time data on any given moment that I can access anywhere, essentially, because it's cloud-based, where we can bring up dashboards on quality measures, testing progress, storyboarding, daily burn downs. All of those things are available to us. And then, of course, we do have to and do formalize our status reporting in weekly reports that are delivered to initially our executives here in the department, and then we distribute those reports essentially to all stakeholders in a summary fashion, and we make those reports also available on our internal extranet site. So we do have that formal status reporting process ingrained, and the reports essentially come from the different work streams in the project. So obviously all the things that the vendor are attending to, our own MIS department, which Mike Myron, who's here, runs. Data conversion reporting comes from the work stream leaders. All of that information is then brought to bear in a comprehensive status report, and then ultimately an executive status report that's delivered across the organization. We review that status report every week with our secretary and an internal executive committee, and we discuss all of the risks that are emerging, all of the impediments, things that are blocking us from moving forward, and all of the core measures and metrics within the project. I think one of the key things about reporting, and really the position that we take, is we hide nothing, and we encourage everybody to hide nothing. If there is a problem, if there is a risk, it needs to be brought to management. This certainly by far is no different than any project, Agile or otherwise, but we really bring forth, and as management folks here, we believe it really is our role to raise the awareness of anything that could cause the project to go sideways or upside down. And so we take that. If it's something that needs more attention, or that is an issue that needs to be resolved between the department and the vendor, we will raise that to an executive steering committee, which is actually comprised of our information technology arm, which is driven by our cabinet secretary, James Collins, there, and also the core key vendor leaders and our department leaders. And it's there that anything that we can't resolve from a team perspective gets resolved and action gets taken forward for resolution. And that all starts with project reporting. So, okay, thank you.
Sure, thank you, Peter. So was this the first Agile project for your executive team? Were there significant questions in the kind of information they wanted from the project management team, and notably in the timing of their need for information? What kind of education or stage setting did you have to do for your executive steering committee? Are they asking for different kinds of information from you for FACTS 2 than they did for previous waterfall projects?
Yes, hi, this is Pete again. This was the first Agile project that the department has ever undertaken, and they had been involved in a waterfall project in the past, and so this was really their first tug at it. As part of that, there was a lot of information that needed to be provided to the department in terms of how we approach Agile, how we govern from a project governance perspective, the type of metrics, how our steering committees all work together to resolve problems, and the mechanics of managing and monitoring against story points in an Agile framework, however, with a fixed scope and a fixed price. So in some respects, this is not a true Agile project. And it's not a true Agile project because if you looked at the 12 disciplines or principles of the Agile manifesto, you'd realize that several of those, the definitions get a little stretched when you're managing against a fixed price, fixed scope project. So what we had to do was share with our executives how we were going to quantify the overall value of this project in story points, and how we were going to measure against those, and how do we accommodate changes, which of course Agile is welcomes change with open arms. And so we had to educate the department based on those things, and these were new concepts for many. And it was difficult to try to reach out to all of the parties and get them on board when their framework was kind of waterfall based. But we put together key meetings where we brought the concepts of Agile forward to the stakeholders. We educated them on the key management and measurement terminology that was involved. We did have to get everybody speaking the same language in terms of how story points and user stories and epics, which are all terminology that we use in Agile. We had to get everybody on the same page in terms of that terminology. And then from that, we then had to, and through that process, the entire time, we were comparing, contrasting Agile to the model that they were used to, and that was Waterfall. Then really we had to help the executives and the management team interpret our reports. We had to change some of the thinking about how we manage risk and how we report risk, and that reporting risks was a good thing on a project, and making that known to everybody was a good thing. And so there was a lot of education that really had to happen in trying to get this set up. We did a number of those things prior to even contract signature, but we had a formal, what we call Sprint Zero, which was a 12-week period that really formalized and helped us to formalize the concepts and educate the organization during that Sprint Zero period. I don't know that, in fact, I don't think they were asking necessarily for different kinds of information, since we were really educating them on a framework. and it was more of a clarification of that framework than them asking specifically for new things.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Did you have to make adjustments in the way you requested federal funding via the APD process? Do your APD and APD updates look different for FACTS 2? What are the major changes in the way you planned or budgeted for this project to accommodate your Agile approach? And could you describe your management plan, or excuse me, were there major changes in the way you described your management plan or presented your business case?
Okay, this is Laura Miles again. In response to the first question about making adjustments in the way we requested federal funding via the APD process, the answer to that question is no. Both our operational system that is live today, known as FACTS, and our current development system, FACTS, renamed as Focus, are both currently funded as a SACWIS. We, like other states, received our federal correspondence with a request to make our intent to transition to CWIS on or before 7/31/18. So we are in the throes of analyzing moving from a SACWIS to CWIS, and the pros and cons thereof. In response to the APD and the APD updates look different for FACTS 2, no, we are currently funded as a SACWIS development effort, as I indicated earlier. In terms of the major changes in the way we planned or budgeted for this project, the key difference between the Waterfall and the hybrid Agile we have on the ground is that the hybrid Agile and the contract we have in place now is paying for performance versus the Waterfall approach that was involved reviewing and approving a defined set of deliverables over the life cycle of the project. So that is the key difference. And in terms of the overall management infrastructure, that was laid as a foundational component in the first 4 months of the project that Peter highlighted, the Sprint Zero planning, clear lines of authority, escalation points, who do you escalate items to, decision-making authority, review and approval details, so laid in the foundation before we actually started the sprint. In terms of presenting the business cases, we had to present our plans for the Focus project both before the federal government, as was highlighted, as well as we have the state organization, our Department of Technology and Information, also requires a business case being vetted through the state monitoring and review process. So we did both. We had to handle the federal detail as well as the state from the business case standpoint.
I just want to add one thing that Laura mentioned, which I think was a very interesting. I hope it's an interesting piece of information. But one of the things that is very difficult is knowing what you're paying for in any project. And with a waterfall, you pay for a lot of documentation up front that you really don't know whether it describes the software solution accurately that you're receiving. And so the way we set this up from a pay-for-performance perspective, we basically have, our project is driven by what we call user stories. And those user stories are essentially the requirements for the project. Each one of those user stories has been estimated with a story point value, which is a relative measure, but we use it to track the entire project. We know, for instance, that our entire project is 16,000 some points. And so we're tracking the progress against those points. When every single month, at the end of the sprint, the vendor has to demonstrate working software to us, not demos or prototypes, but actually walk through the working software against scenarios. Those scenarios all being designed to articulate a set of acceptance criteria in which our business analysts put together And during that process, we either accept that user story or we reject that user story. And at the end of that month, essentially, only those stories that were accepted are that the vendor has a right to invoice us for. We also reserve money at the end to ensure that it all integrates together. But being able to measure their performance and provide a framework that only pays for performance, I think has been a significant upgrade to, I think, the way it's been done in the past.
Laura responds.
That's an excellent point, Pete. And adding to that, the product owners are each 4-week sprint cycle. They are seeing the working software. We're now in sprint 10 on the ground here in Delaware, and we have 5 days every sprint where the product owners and the subject matter experts are reviewing the working software. And then at the very end, the day before the sprint ends on a Thursday, we are having a 3-hour walkthrough demo, pulling that all together.
Okay, great. Thanks to you both. So how much authority have you placed in the BAs and the product managers for decision making? How did you prepare your SMEs and other staff for their Agile roles, and how is this different from past waterfall efforts?
Okay, this is Laura again. The business analysts have specific duties on the project to develop the user stories based on the high-level epics. So when we began this journey, we had 451 very high-level epics that described what we wanted from the new information system. Those are then detailed into detailed user stories, field detail, security profile, et cetera, all the detail that drives a high-level description of a particular business area. So while the BAs work freely with the business subject matter experts, there is close monitoring of their progress in delivering those user stories on time and passing the test of them meeting the definition of ready to be accepted into a sprint build. We have strong monitoring and tracking of the user story development under a detailed gate performance. Initially in the project, we were really monitoring percent completion, and then we got more sophisticated in that we were monitoring the whole life cycle of a user story development from beginning to end and all the details, and who was owning the review and approval at that particular review cycle. The product owner decision-making authority is one of the most critical elements for our project. The establishment of clear roles, responsibilities, authority, and how the team works together is key. Because we are integrating, as I talked about earlier, the 4 service divisions, I, as the executive product owner, work with the 4 product owners from each of the service divisions, and we work as a team through all the items that we are responsible for. The product owners have the authority to make the decisions about how the product is meeting their specific business needs, or conversely, not meeting their needs and how it needs to be addressed to overcome the unmet need. We're dealing with that daily. I, as the executive product owner, have oversight authority on all decisions made and facilitate the resolution of all decision conflicts with the authority to break any ties that might surface related to product decisions. So, as you can imagine, you have 4 distinct business areas. That does come into play in this type of integrated project. In regards to preparing the SMEs, we began a journey of training sessions for all the product owners, the subject matter experts that we thought were going to be heavily involved in this hybrid Agile journey. That included directors, product owners, and the training focused mainly on the Agile processes and user story development, and were provided by the development vendor. In addition, the vendor provided a methods coach early in the project that helped to facilitate the formal sprint activities such as the daily stand-up, Scrum of Scrums meetings, and process improvement sessions that we hold each sprint. So while we started with some initial training, we had some boots on the ground to really guide us through the hybrid Agile journey. From experience, training alone does not prepare SMEs and other staff for a waterfall or an Agile project, quite frankly. Since new staff join the project as the project lifecycle ensues, we have found that it also requires careful communication, follow-up, and in some instances, one-on-one attention to ready staff. We have, in addition to the working software, we have, make no mistake, we have a lot of documents that are very detailed that require careful review by many. And each time a new SME comes on board, we have to guide that new participant and how they approach the design review process and all the details that come with it. Thank you.
Agile stresses working prototypes rather than massive requirements and design documents like waterfall projects. Do you have any concerns about the amount of detail in your product artifacts or the completeness of FACS2 system documentation?
Hi, this is Pete again. No, we really don't have concerns about the level of documentation that we are producing at this point. We wanted to produce just the right level of documentation that would obviously be there to help us support the system moving forward, but it had to be accurate enough and detailed enough to really be able to establish acceptance criterion for a particular user story. So every user story basically is defined, and for those of you who have not worked in Agile, Laura mentioned epics. Epics are very high-level user stories without an enormous amount of detail, and really in order to facilitate development have to be broken down into individual user stories. Our user stories are really the crux of the development activity. So yes, they're actually reasonably detailed, but not overly detailed with a lot of information that's unnecessary. But they do define and codify what we expect and what we can and how we will accept the software once we see that working software in action. It's also to the advantage of our vendor, so that and in particular with the way, since this is a fixed scope, fixed price project, it really was a requirement that it was a little bit more detailed than some Agile projects. Some Agile projects have a little bit more flexibility, and they can kind of change things, have a little bit more freedom in order to make changes beyond what was documented. In ours, we had to strike a balance. We had to have just enough detail to be able to provide acceptance, but also to be able to incorporate change. We also, in Sprint 0, which we mentioned before, which is really our planning and definition phase of the project, we had a set of 22 key documents that were produced as part of Sprint 0. And they were typically strategy documents on how we were going to execute our user acceptance testing, and actually all testing of the project, how we were going to conduct and execute data conversion activities from our existing legacy system, how we were going to accomplish training, our communication documents framework. So a number of these documents that really define the project up front, and that are continuing to guide us through this. Some of those are fairly detailed, and yet not overwhelmingly so. I will say that it was a challenge in 12 weeks to do the reviews for 22 documents and to make those part of our overall framework. But we were able to accomplish that through a lot of hard work by a lot of people. But they really were important to set the stage. So we are also in the process of creating a full set of training documentation, training documents, which are being developed for our train-the-trainer model, which will then be how we move that out to the field from an end-user perspective. So I'd say about Agile project documentation, it kind of runs the gamut, I think, out in the industry. And I think probably there are projects that, if they're not large and complicated like this one, you can certainly get away with less documentation. In our case, we needed to really find the right balance, and I think we effectively did that. Okay.
Okay. So just as a summary question, then, looking back to Sprint Zero, if you knew then what you know now, what would you have done differently?
Yeah, this is Pete, and I think we all want to kind of chime in on this one.
Sure.
Because hindsight certainly is 20/20.
Yes, it is.
From my perspective, I think being in the Sprint Zero in particular, even though we were successful in going through and reviewing, I think we did find elements of a number of those documents that were produced, which were kind of setting the stage, that we probably would have taken a more critical eye to and made some other decisions based on those, and consequently, we've had to work some of those changes into our existing framework. And so I think making sure that you have enough review time during that Sprint Zero session to make sure that you're establishing a really solid framework, I think, is really key. The other is more on the side of staff training and readiness during that Sprint Zero process. More sessions, maybe kind of a deeper dive. And one of the things we toyed around with post-fact was actually having a mock sprint, which would have been, I think, a really helpful activity for our people to get up to speed. So that our mock sprint wouldn't have to be Sprint 1. So those are the things that come to my mind. Laura?
Yes, I had quite a few thoughts on this question. One being realistic use of human resources on the state side of the house. I'm speaking on behalf of the state. Many of our staff on our project have their regular day jobs in addition to covering this very important project. While we have received special permission for some limited overtime pay and other creative solutions, realistically, some staff should be entirely freed up from their daily responsibilities during the project to make it as efficient as possible. And if it were, in my humble opinion, the 4 product owners that I mentioned, and maybe some other key others for future development in other states. Second would be build defect fixing periods into the current schedule and timeline. We conduct routine incremental user acceptance testing. We're planning for 5. We've done 3. We have a 4th one coming up. And as those occur, we do experience defects that need to be triaged. We document those in our tracking tool. We then come together as a team, both the development side and the business. And this requires meeting time to address each individual test ticket to assure that it reaches the correct final resolution. This is time-consuming and should be planned for within the schedule and time frame. So that is not shortchanged. Third, pay close attention to the scheduling detail before you sign on the dotted line. During the planning phase of our project, we established ambitious time frames for ourselves in terms of sprint sessions that could be held and the expected turnaround time for design documentation review. Just look ahead, project ahead, and realistically analyze that. Allow ample review time frames for state staff. Again, much of our turnaround times for documentation review are 2 days, 48 hours. While this sounds somewhat reasonable in a singular, document, from a singular document lens, you need to consider the multitude of items that will require this 2-day turnaround, particularly where there are several reviewers involved, that you need to bring those comments together. Make sure you allow time needed to review, research, and unlock complicated items that need resolution under a 2-day turnaround time, or whatever you define as your turnaround times for documentation. Another topic, account for the learning curve of staff before they achieve sprint peak performance, and factor this into your schedule and timeline. So again, we provided the training, we got our staff ready, and as Pete highlighted, he would have preferred a mock sprint. We went into the sprint, and it is unrealistic to assume that staff will build the team on day one and be high performing from the outset. So plan for that your first sprint might not be at your peak place. Last but not least, for me on this question is write the user stories, what the business needs from the system, with the business details, all the details that each service division that I highlighted needs, but also make sure you factor conversion from the outset, your printing and reporting needs within those user stories from the outset. Thank you.
Mike, you want to add something to that?
More than a pretty face. Hey, this is Mike Myron. My side of this is a little bit more on a technical perspective, and we all know that data conversion in any project, either Agile, Waterfall, whatever, is a huge effort. With Agile, brings some different things into focus. The first question you have to ask and know is whether you're going to convert existing data into a new system, or is it going to bring a brand new system, brand new data, and you'll use the old system as a reporting tool. Because of Agile and because of the way you do development, the conversion turns out to affect everything. It affects your interfaces, report to reporting, and your printers, Laura said. And some of the examples and reasons behind that is, as you're doing development on a specific function, that function may feed other functions in a workflow. On the conversion side, you're only converting specific data for those functions. So when you go to test, you may not have all the data that you need to be available to successfully test. So you may start part of a development in phase 1 or sprint 1, but you may not see that corrected data until sprint 6. So one of my recommendations would be to look at a schema and define a schema coming out of sprint 0. It's not going to be perfect. Your application is going to change. You're going to have new functionality, new requirements, but just a core schema will give you the ability to make sure that you're not missing data. One of the big things we call unaccounted data. As our processes have changed and become more streamlined, there are data elements that are no longer used in the new application. But they sure are needed for historical reasons, for reporting reasons, for print reasons. So with the Sprint 0, that's critical. As Pete said, I think that the Sprint 0, you should not short time it. Take as much time as you need to do it properly, because that will have a major effect on the rest of your project. A couple other things, again, with interfaces, same thing with reporting, with everything else. Testing, if you have files that are going to your partners, and you've got, like us, 52 different partners that we send data to and receive data from. You can't do testing. More and more testing has gotten pushed to the back because pieces of the data elements are not there until specific features and functions have been written and those data elements have been defined. If you define the schema up front, you always have the ability to populate those data fields yourself so that you can do testing. It's not going to be pure accurate testing, but you can make sure the mechanical parts of your processes work. Right. The other thing I would do in Sprint 0, or lesson learned we had, was review the whole technical solution. in Sprint 0. And the reason I say that is as we've developed this application, we found out there are certain pieces of software or needs that didn't come up initially. Didn't come into say, Sprint 5 of our project. Things like it might be electronic signatures. It might be e-notary, where we were scrambling later in the project to identify the product we wanted and the product we would use. Take the time up front, list all the software, all the interfaces, all those mechanical things that need to be in place prior to the project. So, and then the last one is decommissioning. If you're not taking your data with you into your new application, that's a little bit less of an effort, but you still have to decide what you're going to do with it. But in terms of how long you keep an old system around, those things need to be decided in the Sprint 0, not halfway through the project. And this way it's emphasized with your business areas, too, that the old system is going away. Get used to it, get ready for it, and you can find those things up front.
Peter speaks.
I think Laura has a few summary statements she wanted to make as our executive product owner.
Thank you, Pete and Mike. I just wanted to highlight the fact that we have had great support from our federal partners and believe that this is a model for others to follow. We've kept them abreast of everything that has occurred on our project outside of the regular routine federal required documentation. They're in our distribution of key reporting documentation, and that's really been a great thing to have. I encourage other states to rely on your federal partners as a critical resource. Make sure, as you endeavor on your journey for information technology upgrades or replacement systems, that your state officials are as dedicated to your project's efforts as we have in this state. Delaware is fortunate to have the support of the state's highest officials who have helped us to unlock many issues, including those that have involved interagency partners and some really, as Mike highlighted some of the software needs that became known late in the project. I would encourage other states to engage state interagency partners early and often as you consider a CWIS build. They need to be on board and stand with you as the system development life cycle progresses, and you really can't do it without them. And last but not least, we found it was extremely advantageous as we planned our project schedule to account for the holiday blackout period. We didn't initially do that in our earlier phase of our project, and that has really been helpful. So I want to thank everyone for listening to Delaware's information project. We're really excited about it and looking forward to address any questions the states may have.
Elizabeth continues.
So I'd just like to take a minute to thank Laura, Mike, and Peter for sharing so much wonderful information with us. And I think at this time we can go ahead and open up the phone lines for questions. Our operator today is Terry. And Terry, can you tell us how folks can line up on the phone for questions?
Yes, to ask a question on the phone lines, please press *1 on your touch-tone phone and record your name at the prompt. Again, press *1 to ask a question. Please check to be sure that your line is unmuted and record your name at the prompt so that I may introduce your question.
Fantastic. You also can enter questions in the GoToWebinar dialog box under the question feature. If you don't see the dialog box, look for a small white arrow inside an orange box and click on that. It'll open up the dialog box. While we're waiting for folks to line up on the phone, I do have a few questions that came in during the presentation. First, are all activities for producing the incremental product, design, development, and testing accomplished in one sprint?
Peter replies.
Yeah. The answer is yes. So you actually begin the requirements piece, if you will, through the development of user stories. User stories actually cross over sprint boundaries. But we have specific activities. We've developed 7 stages that a user story has to go through in order to be accepted by the vendor into a sprint. That is what we call the definition of ready. We are obligated contractually to meet the definition of ready prior to any user story being accommodated, being accepted into a sprint by the vendor. That piece, once a requirement is accepted into a sprint, then the vendor operates on that requirement. We do clarifications of that requirement. We build the design document. They do development, and then we go through our working software reviews, and we accept the software. It's almost as if each sprint is really kind of a mini waterfall, if you will, and there are acceptance criteria at each gate.
Laura speaks.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. 12 distinct sprints. You are moving a set of defined business detail into that sprint that are meeting the definition of ready. Our cadence is between, right now we're running about 1,600 story points, so whatever that business functionality is goes into the sprint, gets built, reviewed, and approved, and then at the end of the sprint, you're taking accounting of how many story points for that sprint were achieved. So I hope that helps.
Sure. All right. Terry, do we have anyone on the phone?
Currently, there are no questions in the phone queue, but as a reminder, to ask a question on the phone lines, please press *1 and record your name when prompted.
Great, thank you. So our next question online, what software are you producing? Is it COTS or is it built in-house?
So we are building on a cloud-based framework that's called Salesforce. You may have heard it in the industry, or Force.com. So technically, we're building on a Force.com framework, and so that is a cloud-based package. Most of what we're trying to build, we are trying to build within the out-of-the-box capabilities of Force.com, and essentially what that means is we're trying to avoid any custom programming where we can avoid it, because that's ultimately going to be a support issue in the past. We've been fairly successful in providing most of it with the out-of-the-box capability of Salesforce, but we have had to customize certain aspects where Salesforce doesn't meet, for instance, some of the requirements of our business process, or, for instance, a SACWIS requirement. So they will customize using something called Apex, which is like a Java-based language for any programmers out there, or Visual Force, which is an HTML5 type of language, or their SOQL, which is like SQL for any developers out there. So it is, again, so it's leveraging the capabilities within Force.com and customizing where we need to.
Great, thank you. Can you explain a little bit more about how you determined how much a vendor would be paid at the end of each sprint? Are they paid per user story accomplished, or is it tied to the number of story points, or is there some other criteria?
That's a great question. Yes, it's by story points. So when we went through and we completed an assessment of and the vendor looked at all of our epics, provided an estimate, and that became the estimate in story points for the project. 16,477 to be exact. So when we introduce stories into a sprint backlog, that's the work that we're going to do in a sprint. There are points associated with that. As Laura mentioned, we're running between 1,500 and 1,600 story points per sprint. As we go through and we go through our acceptance period, we may only actually accept 1,400 points. We have a dollar value associated with each story point. We simply multiply that dollar value by the story points that were accepted in the sprint, and that's what the vendor is allowed to invoice us against. The stories or the story points that fell out, that were not accepted, are essentially put back on our product backlog and then ultimately reintroduced into a future sprint where there might have been some minor issues, and they'll just absorb it in the sprint. When that story is then accepted, then they are eligible for payment.
Excellent. Thank you. Terry, do we have other folks on the line with questions?
No, there are no questions in the phone queue.
Okay. I think everybody is submitting online today because I do have a few more. Are you able to make your project plans available for other states to see as an example?
We can certainly inquire about that. We've got some yes head shakes probably, but let us check with our officials here to see if we're allowed to do that. Okay?
Certainly, and I think anything that you can share we can make available via the listserv where we sent the announcement about this webinar. So that would be the space to watch for anything that you're able to share, any follow-up materials we're able to post after today's webinar. Another question that's come in, do you have one vendor or multiple vendors? And related, how many Scrum teams do they have running at one time?
Yep.
Okay. On the project, in terms of vendors, we have the development vendor, and then we also have Pete Hales from another contracted vendor serving as the project director, and we also have the project manager through another vendor. So the project really has those two primary vendors on the ground. We also have on the ground, because we have our current information system operating, we have the current vendor on the ground supporting and really helping us through some of the detail conversion details between our fax system and our new target solution Focus. So really two for the project, and then we have the current vendor supporting our current information system. And one other thing I want to highlight is we have the Department of Technology, the state agency, really helping in a large way in our state, supporting the project on the ground in the areas of testing and some other areas. And they also contract with our organizational change management resource on the ground.
Michael replies.
There are two additional from a technical perspective. You have your development team that is one of our vendors. Salesforce itself is a specifically different vendor, and with the way the state of Delaware is, we have a specific contract with Salesforce as a vendor. Then our software developer uses that core product, so you have to treat those as two different vendors. And then we've had a couple other vendors because different pieces of software that we needed to attach and tie in to the project to accomplish things. So, as in software, we're always going to have multiple vendors based on what tools you're going to use.
Yeah, and then related to the Scrum team side of the house, we have 5 operating Scrum teams on the ground. We have 4 primary, and then the 5th one really serving as the interface-focused Scrum team lead. So each of those 5 Scrum teams have some specialized content areas, but the 5th is the interface-focused Scrum Master.
So lots of questions about vendors today. We have another one that's somewhat related. From Waterfall to Agile, have you remained with the same vendor, or I guess same vendors? If so, how did this transition affect your relationship?
We have retained the same vendor as we've moved from the Waterfall to the Hybrid Agile, and we have good working relationships with the vendor on the ground from the Waterfall to the Hybrid Agile. The good working relationship continues.
Michael replies.
One thing in terms of vendors, though, the software vendor stayed the same, right, for both the Waterfall and the Agile. What we did, though, is we did bring an additional vendor in, that being Pete. We brought Pete in at the end of the first part of this to come in and help us do some analysis, saw what worked, didn't work. And so Pete is a new vendor managing the Agile project, which we have not done before.
Thank you, Mike.
Okay. Terry, do we have anyone on the phone waiting to ask a question?
No, there are no participants in the phone queue.
Okay. I have a few more online. This one specifically for Laura, but I think others jump in as well. How much information about the project are you sharing with the line staff around the state? Do you think that the change management user readiness activities are similar, or are they different for an Agile project than in a Waterfall project?
Okay. Yeah. So we have an organizational change management resource on the ground that I mentioned that is coming by way of a contract, state contract that exists in the state. We are sharing information, cascading primarily through the division directors, the leadership team, the product owners on the ground, regular routine management information sessions held throughout the state. We built a project website that pushes monthly detail that contains the newsletters and other critical information about the project. So I really think, and the other thing we're building is, I think this is critical, is even though we have the project largely housed at the administrative offices, we are building and setting about a change agent network that will cascade local champions in the local offices to really bring them along. We have been, through our website, delivering compare and contrast our current information, look and feel of our solution to what it's going to look like in focus, trying to bring the users from here's what it looked like, when we designed our current information system. We've upgraded all through the years, but here's what it looked like before, and when you're doing a child abuse and neglect intake, here's what it's going to look like after in focus, in the focus solution. So those are just some of the elements we have on the ground at this juncture.
Great, thank you. You spoke earlier about being very open about reporting risks. Has that helped you get the support that you need from the Executive Steering Committee to address those risks?
Yeah, hi, this is Pete. Yes, absolutely. The only way to get attention in a project as aggressive as this is to raise it to the highest levels. And all of the highest levels see those risks every week in our reports. And in some cases, we have actually scheduled impromptu Executive Steering Committee meetings to raise the level of risk on projects. There is no reason nor excuse for not raising the flag on things. The projects that fail are typically the ones where risks weren't addressed. And I believe that really from an IT development management perspective, our world is really about risk management. So our executives here in the state have operated with a complete willingness and openness for us to raise issues, and it basically helps us to break the logjam in pushing issues forward. And we've had, as any project, we've had several, some requiring additional resources, some requiring potentially more money, and we've been able to break that logjam by making sure that everybody understands the risk, mitigation plans are put in place, and action is taken.
Great, thank you. Terry, do we have anyone on the line with additional questions?
No, there are no participants on the phone lines.
Okay, I do have one last online question. Is this a firm fixed price contract? And if it is, does that make it harder or more important to manage risk without using all of your reserve funds at the end?
So I'll start, and if you want to jump in, Laura, as well. Yes, it's more difficult this is a firm fixed contract. It is more difficult to manage against the firm fixed contract. And what you have to ultimately be concerned about and should factor into any project are change sprints. You may not know, as we build our user stories, obviously anything that fails from a defect perspective, the vendor is obligated to fix. But what you'll recognize is that as you get through the project and they start and your product owners and SMEs begin seeing working software, they will recognize and identify changes to the software beyond what was documented or described in user stories. And there needs to be an understanding that there's some percentage that needs to be reserved for changes. And I think probably as I'm looking at this particular project, and from considering it was fixed price, I think if I were to make a change moving forward for this type of project, I would build in specific change sprints, possibly a shorter 2-week sprint where we accommodate critical changes. And by the way, you have to manage and measure. You have to manage your changes in your product backlog, but changes that are critical for go live need to be addressed, and they need to be absorbed fairly early in the process. So it might be the case that for every 2 4-week sprints that you engage in, that you might have a 2-week sprint interspersed every second or third sprint to be able to accommodate and absorb the changes that are a little harder to absorb in a fixed price, fixed scope project. Anybody else, Laura or
no,
Mike? You want to?
I think you. Okay. Yeah, I think you got it.
Okay. Terry, do we have anyone on the phone with questions?
No, there are no participants in the phone queue.
Okay, well then I'm going to go back to our Delaware presenters. We have no more questions online, so I don't know if you have any last words that you wanted to share with us about the hybrid model that you've been implementing.
The only thing we didn't elaborate on, and I think it's really important, is that because these systems have to become integrated and work together at the end, even though you're building different pieces, functionality, different time, one of the things that Pete and Laura built into the project is what we call IUAT, Integrated User Acceptance Statement, incremental.
Incremental user acceptance tests. Yeah.
What that's done is we've taken multiple sprints, put them together, and tested them so the workflow from sprint 1 goes all the way through sprint 3. So that takes some planning because you need to make sure that things are building upon each other and that they're not 3 random functionalities in those 3 different sprints that don't work together. That's been a big thing for us in our testing. It was a way of measuring where we actually are with the project and identifying, how good the software is. More than just seeing a demo and seeing the actual system. When our clients got down to sit down and touch the system, again, to Pete's point, it's one thing to be the design or talk about how something's going to work, but when you sit down and do it, it was critical in finding out where we were.
Yeah, and then I think just as a quick add-on to that, you're essentially weeding out defects that you might not otherwise have found until your final UAT, which is again helping to course direct the project, helping to accommodate and in change and really try to address some of the things that Agile was designed to address. So, yeah, I think that's a good point, Mike. Thank you for bringing that up.
Okay. All right. Well, in closing, I just would really like to thank the 3 of you. This has been, I think, a very interesting and very valuable discussion for this group. I know that we've talked about Agile versus Waterfall sort of at a higher level, and I think having such a practical on-the-ground example has been really useful for people to think about. So thank you all. I appreciate the time that you put into thinking about today's presentation and discussion and for your candor and sharing your experience with us. So thanks to the 3 of you, and thank you also to our audience for hanging in and asking such insightful questions. I think that really added something to our discussion today. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and wind things up.